Welcome to Crime Story, where the darkest secrets are brought to light. Today, I'm taking you deep into one of the most chilling and disturbing true crime stories ever uncovered, the tale of the Mexican Mafia and how they used acid to erase thousands of lives, silently, completely, without a trace. It's a story that will make your skin crawl, not because of what was seen, but because of what was meant to stay hidden forever. If you find this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more gripping crime stories to you, stories that demand to be told. Now, get ready. Take a deep breath. Because this story starts where most people stop looking. Let's begin. In the dusty outskirts of Tijuana, where heat lingers in the air like a ghost and silence speaks louder than words, stories began to rise from the cracks in the ground. They weren't told in full sentences, just fragments, whispers. People disappeared. They stepped out for groceries, for work, for a walk. And never came back. No screams. No signs. Just an aching emptiness. Rumors grew wild like weeds, of a man, a place, and something dark bubbling just beneath the surface. In 2009, that darkness got a name. Not a name people could forget, but one that stuck like a stain: El Pozolero. The stew maker. Santiago Meza López. He wasn't the one pulling the trigger. He wasn't the one calling the shots. His job came after. When the screaming had stopped. When silence had fallen. He was the man who made evidence vanish, not with fire, or the river, but with barrels of something far worse. Acid. Day after day, he poured it over the forgotten. Not in some lab, not in secret, but under the open sky, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to stop him. He didn't run a factory. He ran a void. And what's most chilling? He didn't seem angry. Or proud. Just, matter of fact. Like he was fixing broken furniture. Like he wasn't erasing lives, just doing a job. He looked like no one special. A man you'd pass on the street and never remember. Santiago Meza had the face of someone who'd blend into the crowd, not the face you'd imagine behind one of the darkest secrets in Mexico's criminal underworld. He was quiet. Grew up in a rural village. Didn't finish school. Said little. Did as he was told. But sometimes, it's the quiet ones who carry the loudest horrors. Santiago wasn't a boss. He wasn't a killer with a name on the most wanted list. He was something more unnerving, an invisible piece of the puzzle. A man whose job wasn't to end lives, but to erase them. Entirely. He worked for the Arellano Felix cartel, one of the most ruthless drug empires in Mexico. A cartel known for ruling with terror and silencing anything that stood in its path. But while others dealt with power, territory, and bloodshed, Santiago had a different role. He was the man who cleaned up. The one who came in after the chaos. After the gunfire stopped and the dust had settled. His hands didn't pull the trigger. They poured acid. Barrels of it. And not once. Not twice. But again. And again. And again. When he was finally caught, he didn't scream. He didn't run. He spoke with a calmness that made his words land like a punch to the stomach. I was paid £440 a week, he said, as if it was just another job. As if this was some grim, twisted version of clocking in and out of a factory. He estimated that he had dissolved the remains of at least 300 people. 300. He remembered it the way others remember work deadlines or grocery lists. Numbers. Just numbers. But each number was a life. A face. A family that waited. That hoped. That never got answers. And there was one sentence he said that still echoes in the halls of the police station: my busiest time was in December 2007. I had to deal with 32 bodies at once. 32. In a single month. That wasn't work. That was industrial erasure. And he did it, day after day, in a forgotten place outside Tijuana, with no oversight, no questions, and no hesitation. What does it take to do something like that, and sleep at night? Was it fear? Obedience? Or something deeper? Something darker? How does a person cross the line from ordinary to something unthinkable? That question echoes every time someone hears the name Santiago Meza. Because what he did wasn't a one-time event. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was a job that existed in the shadows, hidden beneath layers of fear and silence. Santiago didn't see himself as a villain. Not in the beginning. He said he didn't start with evil in his heart. He simply obeyed. And in his mind, obedience kept him alive. The rules were clear. Do what you're told. Don't ask. Don't look too closely. Stay quiet, and survive. He said he didn't know the names of the people he handled. He didn't want to. They were just assignments. He was handed barrels of industrial chemicals, corrosive, deadly, and told to follow a method known only to a few. No one trained him with manuals. No one gave him safety gear. They gave him orders. That was enough. The location? An empty patch of land near Tijuana's edge. Far from the main roads. No one asked questions there. No one dared to. Each day, he would arrive early. Alone. The desert sun above. A shovel in one hand, acid barrels beside him. And then, the process began. Barrels were tipped. Liquid hissed as it touched bone. The smell, sharp, bitter, unforgettable, filled the air. But Santiago didn't flinch. He'd done it too many times. It became routine. A ritual of silence and disappearance. He said he stopped thinking about it. He focused only on the steps. As if by narrowing his mind, he could forget what he was really doing. Sometimes, the silence was broken, a bird flying overhead, a truck rumbling in the distance. But even then, Santiago said he never looked up. Never paused. The faster he worked, the less time he had to feel. He convinced himself he wasn't the one responsible. He never held a weapon. He never chose who came. He was just the last step. A cleaner. A cog in a terrible, hidden machine. But machines break. Secrets leak. And one day, so did his. When authorities finally tracked him down, it was as if the myths had come to life. Locals had heard the rumors of a man who made bodies vanish like vapor. Most dismissed it as cartel folklore. But now, the headlines told the truth. The stew maker was real. And the horror was far worse than anyone had imagined. When the cuffs clicked around Santiago Meza's wrists in early 2009, there was no resistance. No wild chase. No panic in his eyes. He stood there as if he had been waiting, not just for the police, but for the weight of everything he had done to finally catch up. And when they brought him in, he didn't ask for a lawyer. Didn't plead for mercy. He talked. And what he said turned the room cold. He told investigators about the land. The barrels. The bodies. And just like that, a whisper became a scream. He guided them to barren patches of earth on the outskirts of Tijuana, places so ordinary, they might have been mistaken for junkyards or construction zones. But beneath the cracked soil, the story changed. The air was thick. The ground, disturbed. There were no signs, no memorials, no names carved into stone. Just loose dirt, soaked with secrets too heavy to stay buried. Investigators began to dig. What they unearthed was not a crime scene, it was a graveyard without order, without respect. Rusted barrels. Scorched patches of ground. Torn clothing. Old shoes. Bits of metal. And, from time to time, something worse, fragments that once belonged to someone. Every new discovery came with a silent scream. And word spread fast. Families who had been searching for years arrived with hope in their eyes and grief in their hearts. They lined the fences, clutching faded photographs of brothers, sons, fathers. People who had vanished without a trace. Some came with rage, they demanded to see Meza face to face. Others begged the police to show him pictures, to make him remember. To force him to see the people behind the process. The lives behind the liquid. Meza remained quiet. Calm. He didn't deny. He didn't apologize. He simply explained, step by step, like someone describing how to fix a broken engine. It was that cold. That mechanical. But to the families watching from behind the barriers, it wasn't mechanical at all. It was raw. It was everything they had feared and more. For them, this wasn't closure. Closure needs a body. Closure needs a place to mourn. What they got was something else. They got the truth, ugly, heavy, and incomplete. But still, truth. And in a country where truth is often buried deeper than the dead, that meant something. The story of Santiago Meza wasn't just about one man dissolving the remains of the fallen, it was a reflection of something much bigger, much darker. It was about a war. Not the kind fought with rules or uniforms, but the kind where power is currency, silence is armor, and fear is the only law that still works. Between 2007 and 2009, cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez weren't just cities anymore. They were battlefields. The streets weren't places to walk. They were places to watch your back, to whisper, to disappear without warning. The war wasn't announced. It was understood. And everyone, whether they wanted to or not, was a part of it. Two major forces were at play, the Arellano Felix cartel, brutal and deeply rooted, and the faction led by Teodoro Garcia Cimental, equally feared, equally ruthless. Their rivalry wasn't about ideology or justice. It was about control, territory, pride, and profit. Each side had soldiers, lookouts, weapons. But what made this war terrifying wasn't just the scale of violence, it was the way violence became strategy. Swift. Precise. Erasing not just enemies, but entire identities. That's where Meza fit in. He wasn't just cleaning up messes. He was helping rewrite reality, scrubbing away the very proof that people had ever lived, ever fought, ever died. The method was efficient. Eliminate the threat. Then make them disappear. No body. No case. No noise. For the cartel, Meza wasn't a monster, he was a necessary tool. A part of their system. And systems like that thrive in places where trust is dead and fear grows wild. By the end of 2008, more than 5,300 people had been lost in these wars. Not just gang members. Not just targets. Shop owners. Taxi drivers. School kids. People who happened to be standing in the wrong place when a message needed to be sent. This wasn't random chaos. It was controlled terror. Designed to keep people quiet. Keep the government guessing. Keep everyone just scared enough to look the other way. And as long as the bodies kept vanishing, the fear kept working. The war without rules wasn't fought with honor. It was fought with acid. With whispers. With silence. If the revelations in Tijuana rattled the country, what surfaced nearly a decade later would break it wide open. In 2018, deep in the northern territories of Mexico, far from Santiago Meza's familiar killing grounds, authorities uncovered something far worse, something no one had been prepared to face. A field. Isolated. Quiet. But beneath its cracked, sun-beaten soil lay the remnants of a silent genocide. This wasn't a case of hundreds. This was a case of thousands. The reports began as whispers. An anonymous informant came forward with directions to a site that, until then, had been nothing more than a scar on the land. When investigators arrived, they found bones, not in a mass grave, but scattered across open earth like forgotten relics of war. Thousands of fragments, covering the size of a football field. Torn shoes. Faded shirts. Bits of jewelry. Personal items that once belonged to people with names, families, birthdays. Now, they were echoes. Footnotes in a tragedy too vast to understand. According to the informant, these victims had suffered the same fate Meza once described, only this time, the scale was unimaginable. Bodies had been soaked in acid, the same corrosive method used in Tijuana. But here, the destruction went further. After the bones softened, they were burned, crushed, and spread out, making identification nearly impossible. Forensic teams worked around the clock, piecing together what they could. But the damage was too deep. Time had eroded faces, names, and identities. What remained was a sea of anonymity. This was not the work of a lone monster. This was systemic. Organized. Carried out over years, maybe longer. And no one noticed. Or maybe they did, but chose not to see. The magnitude of what had happened was staggering. Families from across the country came forward, clutching missing persons reports that had long since faded. Mothers. Fathers. Sons. All hoping that maybe, just maybe, a scrap of fabric or a tooth would bring their loved one home. But science couldn't promise that. Not here. Not after all this time. This field was more than a crime scene. It was a graveyard built by silence. By complicity. And by a war that had no boundaries, no headlines, and no mercy. The discovery rewrote the scale of horror. It wasn't just Meza. It wasn't just Tijuana. It was everywhere. And the question grew louder with every unearthed bone: how many more fields like this were still out there? How could so many disappear, so silently? How could the earth hold thousands of secrets, and yet the world above keep spinning like nothing ever happened? The answer isn't complicated. It's chilling in its simplicity: fear. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of being noticed. Of speaking too loudly. Of asking the wrong question at the wrong time. In places controlled by cartels, fear becomes part of the air. You breathe it in. You learn to move around it. And, most importantly, you learn to stay silent. People knew. Or at least, they sensed it. The strange smells. The abandoned lots. The families that stopped laughing at dinner. But what could they do? In a system where justice is distant and danger is next door, survival becomes a game of obedience. You don't call the police, because sometimes, the police don't answer. Or worse, they're part of it. In cities like Tijuana and Juarez, law enforcement wasn't always shielded. They were sometimes victims. And sometimes tools. In 2010, a grisly message made its way to a local police station, a cooler, left outside like a forgotten lunchbox. Inside, 2 severed heads. No names. No explanations. Just a note. A warning to those who still believed they could fight back. Another time, 25 bodies were found in the back of a truck. Hands tied. Eyes blindfolded. No survivors. Not a single voice left to explain what had happened. Because it wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to paralyze. These weren't just acts of violence, they were performances. Carefully choreographed acts of terror meant to echo through neighborhoods like broken prayers. The message was always the same: we are watching. We are listening. And we do not forget. That's why people stayed quiet. That's why even when they suspected, they turned the other way. Because in this world, silence wasn't cowardice. It was wisdom. It was instinct. And for many, it was the only thing keeping them alive. The cycle fed itself. Fear bred silence. Silence bred impunity. And impunity kept the machines of death running smoothly. Year after year. Victim after victim. Until mass graves became landmarks, and people began to forget that life was ever meant to be lived without fear. Santiago Meza may have confessed. He may have led investigators to the burial sites, stood in front of flashing cameras, and described his methods with robotic clarity. But justice, real justice, is harder to find. There were no courtrooms big enough to hold the grief. No prison cell deep enough to bury the pain. Because even as Meza spoke, many families were still waiting. Still hoping. They brought old photographs, worn with time. They watched news reports with trembling hands, looking for any hint that their loved one might be among the unnamed. But most never got answers. No names. No confirmations. Just dirt, bones, and silence. In the face of that silence, some refused to sit still. Volunteers like Vida Ortiz became the beating heart of a different kind of justice, one that didn't wear a badge or carry a gun. Since 2015, she and others like her have walked into fields that once held death and dug with bare hands. They've uncovered nearly 90,000 human remains from over 40 hidden sites. Their work is quiet, slow, often heartbreaking, but it is essential. Because without them, the forgotten stay forgotten. Without them, the names stay erased. The story of the stew maker is no longer about just one man. It's about the shadow he cast, a shadow large enough to stretch across an entire country. It's about a nation still bleeding from wounds no one dares to name. About the survivors who carry grief like a second skin. And about a world where silence is often louder than screams. The acid may have dissolved the bodies, but it couldn't erase the memory. It couldn't erase the ache. Santiago once said, "I never asked questions. I just did what I was told." He said it like a defense. Like a shield. But when your task is to destroy hundreds of lives, to erase the evidence of human existence, is obedience enough? Does following orders make it any less monstrous? Or is it just another way to hide? This isn't just the story of a man who made people disappear. It's the story of a system, built on fear, silence, and unchecked power. A system that swallowed towns, turned families into shadows, and taught people that staying quiet was the only way to live. And now, as the dust settles, one question still hangs heavy in the air, one that refuses to be buried. In a world where so many voices are silenced, who will speak for the ones who vanished? Thank you for watching this episode of Crime Story. Some stories are hard to tell, and even harder to forget. The case of the stew maker reminds us that behind every headline is a human life, a grieving family, and a silence that still echoes today. If this story moved you, or made you think, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with more haunting true crime stories from around the world. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and never stop asking the hard questions. This is Crime Story, where the truth always finds a voice.